All right, so we'll get started. Thank you everybody for joining us today for a session on data culture. Molly and Karen, thank you so much for joining already. We'll kind of get to your respective introductions in a couple of minutes. But very pleased that we can have this session today on this topic that I think has become ever more important for a lot of the organizations that we are working with and have been working with in the past. So Molly will come introduce you when we get to the panel part, and we're very pleased to have you here. Maybe
Thank you.
well, before we kind of get started with the initial kind of couple minutes of an introduction into kind of this concept of data culture, Ganand, would you mind introducing yourself as well?
Definitely. First of all, thank you everyone for being here. I'm Karan Dawal, working at CS on data strategy, innovations, and alliances. I have deep passion for data and AI culture. I also teach at Carnegie Mellon on Chief Data and AI Executive course. Happy to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. And myself, my name is Willem Koenders. I'm a lead our data strategy practice across a couple of sectors, including medical technology, HPP, financial sector, and a few others. Data has been a passion for me as long as I can remember. I've worked all my working life in data, and specifically data culture is something that we talk about a lot. It kind of it skirts around the edges of a lot of the work we do, but it's not very often that we kind of like really kind of take hold of this topic and dive into it. So that's what we plan to do today. So wanted to spend just we'll try to do it quickly, just maybe 10-ish minutes, 15 minutes on some of the key concepts before we have a discussion with Molly and Karan about like how they've seen in their real lives how data culture kind of plays a role and kind of can help drive value for different organizations. So just to start about kind of data culture and to what extent it's really important. A couple of factoids. We could have grabbed any number of these, but according to some of the research out there, most of the companies feel that they haven't really gotten to have an established data culture, right? So Data IQ here has reported that 9 out of 10 feel that they lack a data culture. But yet, at the same time, a company like Elation and many others have said that those who do have a data culture tend to overperform in a commercial sense, right? They exceed the revenue targets, their profitability targets more often than not. Having said that, it's not standing still. Like a lot of organization, a lot of data leaders have started to focus in on kind of this concept of data culture and data literacy. And it depend by some measures, it has doubled in the last kind of year or two the number of organizations who feel that they have started to establish an actual culture in this sense, right? And then I think maybe the more, let's say, most tactical one or the most explicit one, you can see that a lot of people in roles like Molly, like you had in the past, more than 50% of those have indicated that they will secure funding and resourcing to specifically invest in things like data culture and data literacy. But what is it, data culture? So like, how would we define a data culture? So I'm committing a bit of a crime against the best practice of a presentation that you shouldn't put too much text in front of people, right? But like here we are. A couple of these definitions. And kind of what you see is that across these different definitions that come from different organization is that you both see kind of common parts to a definition. You can also see that it takes actually quite a couple of words to kind of get to the core of what data culture really means. And then there's some differences as well. So if you look at the one from Tableau at the top left, it talks about collective behaviors and beliefs of people who value, practice, and encourage the use of data to improve decision making. If you look at the one at the middle at the top, data culture is more related to an organizational environment. So where data is not just valued, it's also accessible. It kind of emphasizes data use a little bit more. If you look at the right, the definition from BARC, it tends to take data culture and define it as a sub area of corporate culture. So think about shared values, social norms, ways of thinking within a given organization. If you go to talent and question pro on the bottom left, you see kind of some of these common concepts come back again. Collective behaviors, beliefs of employees who share a common understanding about enterprise data and you use it for their decisions. a set of values, beliefs again, practices. I think a lot of these concepts kind of come back over and over again. And so when we took 25 publicly available definitions of a data culture, we were able to create a word cloud like the one that you can see on the left here, right? So you see concepts like decision making is probably the biggest one here, right? So you want to move away from potentially like driving on intuition and going into like data-driven decision making. Its behaviors, it obviously has an organizational context, right? Data culture isn't, let's say, the same for every culture. Like you could be in the same sector, in the same company, in the same kind of area and yet have a very different data culture. We see beliefs. And so it kind of helps us come to a working definition of sorts that data culture, let's say for us here today, is the collective behaviors, beliefs, and practices that emphasize transparency, collaboration, innovation, and decision-making processes, right? And in that sense, it involves analytics, data-driven insights into those daily operations, that mindset that eventually helps you treat data like a true corporate asset. So making this very practical, and I'll keep it short and then kind of hand it over to you. So what does that mean, that definition? So you can take a definition or an understanding of data culture to changes, like an evolution you would try to drive. So on the left-hand side, if you can see kind of things that might be true for a lot of organizations who haven't quite made that transition into a stronger data culture. So data itself might not really be owned. It might exist in silos, potentially a lot of red tape around it, versus where you would like to be is, it's a shared ownership. You have actual owners identified as an asset, right? Data is an asset. It might be where we are today, might be restricted access, it's fragmented, reactive, versus where you would like to be is that it's way more democratized, right? The right data to the right people at the right time, obviously subject to the right kind of access controls. Then the one we talked a little bit about on the previous page, if you think about intuition, driving ad hoc behavior, gut feeling, like that's what you'd like to get away from, right? We'd like to be more about like data informed or data driven, analytical, evidence based. That's the type of behavior you would like to see. A few more things on the bottom left too. It might be the case that in organizations that we're seeing a lot today that like this data literacy, right, a related concept, might not be as developed as you'd like it to be. Some of the related expertise is somewhat isolated. You see that governance is either maybe not really given the right attention or it's inconsistent, leading to data quality that isn't, let's say, fully there. Some reactive fixes versus if you project that onto a target state where you'd love to be, you would talk about high literacy, about widespread expertise, you're confident about our data, there's robust enough data, robust enough governance, and quality of the data so that you can trust it for the purposes that you have in mind. So with that, having tried to get through some of the maybe the dry theory and definitions, Khan was be great if you can talk us through kind of different types of cultures and maybe how you've seen it in your experiences.
No, definitely. First of all, thank you. Well, we kind of covered the basic, like what is a data culture, and it 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 becomes very specific to a company. So let's start with four, high level concepts, right? A company culture. Like I'm sure every company has a culture, and then we have a company business strategy, right? Then same thing. Then you have to have a data culture and a data strategy, right? But then between the data cultures, which is again linking back to that company strategy and a company culture, are eight broad buckets of data culture or kinds of data culture. And then again, at some point, we'll talk a little bit more in the next slide about, how these are proactive versus reactive. But let's start from top left. So strategic data culture. So think of this as a company where the data fuels their strategic goals, right? So you've got your business strategy aligned to data strategy, and the culture is then built into what behavior and leadership drives that strategic initiatives, right? And each of these have, different ways of maturing them. We'll go to the top right, operational data culture. Again, this is where it's all about operations and efficiency, right? So the data culture is all about how can we leverage data to make things better the way we do it. Programmatic data culture is very specific to initiatives. If the company is going through a big transformation projects, that's where they want to make sure that the data supports those transformational initiatives. Uh, Top right, innovative data culture, and this is where this is the most, and we'll talk about this is the most proactive way of having a data culture and building it is the innovative data culture where data experts, right, will come back and come up with ideas on innovation, say, this is the data we have. How do we experiment with the data? How do we monetize the data? How do we create more data products? And that kind of becomes a DNA of the company culture. And that's where the innovative data culture comes in. Bottom left, when we talk about customer-centric data culture, so this again is part of that reactive data culture, where we are looking at customer focus as and the customer insights as being that data driven culture. Again, uh, very reactive compliance driven data culture. So we see a lot of this in banks and insurance or very heavily regulated industry where compliance kind of drives the data culture. We want to make sure that everything is uh, you know compliant and data in this case, usually the data leaders will also report to chief risk officer. So all of these data cultures also have a way of who the overall sponsor is, which usually is the chief data and AI officer, and where to report to, which we're not covering here, but again that the intention of who is assigned to create a data culture comes as type of that business strategy. We are we are then talking about collaborative data culture. So this is where it's again very proactive data culture where we want to work and have the company work across cross-functional teams. So across multiple business units, you want to promote data sharing, things like that, and that becomes the part of the company DNA's collaborative data culture. And then, of course, a performance-driven data culture where the business performance KPIs kind of drive the need for data accuracy, data health, quality become really important in all the cultures. But in performance-driven data culture, all the KPIs and decision traceability of what happened when and who took the decision becomes really, really paramount. We can go to the next slide and it kind of talks a little bit about further, bucketizing them and the need for, these data cultures and those buckets. So again, proactive versus reactive. It all depends on from what the company focus is, right? So we, of course, would want companies to be more proactive in their data culture and creating that external or internal data products and monetizing the data. So innovative, strategic, performance driven, and customer centric are some of those data cultures we talked about, which are top down needed for proactive business growth, right? And then when you talk about programmatic, compliance driven, operational, these are need for the business to make sure that operational efficiencies and compliance and operational work gets done. Now, there's always the double-edged, hey, we want to make sure we are doing all of these things, but from a data strategy perspective, when the discussion comes on, who leads data culture, it comes back to driving the decision of what we want to be, and then having that bottom-up and top-down alignment on data culture and focus. With that, Willem, we can go to next slides and kind of give it back to you to talk further, with Molly on how do
Yep.
we measure some of these things and discuss.
Yep, almost get to I think the most interesting part. Like real quick, maybe just for anybody who's thinking about data culture and kind of contemplating to drive change, right? Where to start? Like how to think of this as almost have a journey, a managed journey of sorts. And so wanted to quickly talk through what kind of maybe 5 phases of sorts are that you could recognize. So there is an initial step of assessing and understanding where you are today. And it sounds like a bit like, do you really need to do that? Like, isn't data culture? But we kind of know it's not there. But it really does help to understand maybe where the key pain points are, what kind of the specific behaviors are, especially also kind of understanding maybe these archetypes, Karan, that you just mentioned, right? Because like each of those different data cultures might require kind of a slightly different approach to how you would activate it. And then defining it, like I gave you a couple of definitions in the beginning, but really in the context of a given company, envisioning what is that future state, like what would we like people to behave like, what are the key stakeholders, and bring them into the discussion relatively early. Then the one in the middle here about roadmap and operational realignment. So it would just help to make this an actually explicit change, right? There's an actual roadmap of sorts of things that you can actually do. Think about trainings, things about webinars like this that you can do internally, and other sorts of activation engagements. And then the operating model itself as well. Like if you think about roles like a data owner or data steward, they might have a pretty defined role in this whole journey, but there's other roles such as a business process owner or system owners who aren't necessarily spending the entire day on data culture, but you would really like them to reinterpret what they do into the light of this kind of data culture perspective. Then driving the initiatives. So that's where you actually do the work, right? You actually start, re kind of orienting the behavior. You do the trainings. You might, kick off one of these change programs. You promote the engagement, and you try to drive the actual data-driven behavior and try to track, the last step here. Try to monitor and maintain as you move along. So it is helpful. It's not easy, but it's helpful to at times try to see there's different ways you can measure some of this behavior, like certain if people use certain data sets, if they're certain the way that certain decisions are being made. But in any case, the last bit here is the monitoring maintain step that I think follows in almost any change journey. All right, under 20 minutes, we got now to I think the part where we'll make this a little bit more lively. So Molly, going to bring you into the discussion here. I will give you a question in a minute, but I just wanted to kind of introduce you to kind of the folks who are live have joined us today and who are going to be looking at the recording as well. So you and I have known each other for many years. I'm very proud and pleased to have you on today. Some of the things are on the page here, but you're widely recognized as a very strategic technology leader, very expertise on very deep technological understanding and expertise, large scale migrations that you've run. You've served as a trusted advisor to many people. I've seen it firsthand. The executives, regulators, folks throughout the organization alike, and throughout your career, have seen that you've been able to manage very diverse, very global teams across highly, highly matrixed organization, which makes something like a data culture maybe even harder sometimes maybe to drive it home. But I would love to hear from you in a minute or two. You build very strong partnerships that have enabled the navigation of these very complex, long-lasting transformations. Again, subject to challenges from a regulatory and cultural perspective. And yeah, just wanted to say I'm very proud and pleased to have you on. And yeah, thanks for taking some time to share some of your expertise with us.
And thank you, William. I'm really looking forward to our discussion. And like you said, we've worked in the past for a long time, and it's really interesting. I actually enjoyed hearing through everything that you and Karen also just discussed. So hope to bring it live with some of my discussions.
Awesome. All right, so maybe first question, Molly, we just introduced you, but love to start with you. As mentioned, you've led a very large global organization. You've had a front row seat. If you weren't on the podium, I guess you were, on the front row of the show in a way, on how companies can help, a data culture. So, as a former CIO of such a global organization, how did you think about this? How do you think about creating a culture on data? What did it mean for you and your teams?
Yeah, no, for me, data culture is all about making data-driven decisions by default and not by exception, right? Of course, data democratization is key. Data has to be accessible, but the first three things that matter for me is that data is the strategic asset. You and Karan have brought that up. We build systems and processes around the data, and not vice versa. So everything's around the data. We talk about data democratization, but for me, it is with embedded guardrails. You have to have the checks and balances in place because you're going to use that data to make your decisions to you're going to be using AI systems that are going to be leveraging the data. So you have to know that the data has come from trusted data sources. There's access control around it. There's auditability, traceability, quality controls in place. The data timeliness, all of that matters. So when I was looking through those categories that, you and Karen went through, for me, all of them are important, right? Because when you look at the business data strategy, the innovative, some of what you had on the right-hand top corner, to me is the what's and the whys, right? And then, of course, you have how do you enable this data? And then, what you had as the internal is what makes it what I would say clean data, the resilience and the governance of it, because you have to trust your data. So for me, it really comes down to how, from when I created the culture, for me, one of the biggest things was building partnerships. Partnerships with the business for me was extremely important. We had to function as one team, right? Working as true partners, we are focused on business outcomes, addressing the same roadblocks together, right? So it isn't, working across a wall. So it really comes down to understanding what the business outcome is and joining up to build up these capabilities. When you start looking, when data is managed across within businesses, that's where you have silos, right? Or you have a
Uh-huh.
business depending on technology to get the data. There's your second silo, right? So to be able to work through it, if you work backwards from the outcome, and that's what I helped in, bringing the teams together. So we started small. You can't boil the ocean. So you started small, started with one or two processes, and then you start becoming believers, and it feeds on to it, right? So some examples that to bring it to life is we created 100% automation for assessing the deposit flow of funds, monitoring balance across multiple dimensions like entering, leaving customers of the bank, wealth transfers, intra-product movements. We increased the ability for the business to assess data that was in years rather than in months. And of course, with the understanding that the data had controls, checks, and balances. And we changed the ways of working. What used to become a project done quarterly or something has now become BAU, business as usual. You have it, you get near real-time data, and the bar gets risen, right? Same thing, customer 360. The effort in consolidating relationship data, looking at the credit exposure, creating utilization dashboards. Since we had all of our customer data, the relationship data, all of that housed in our data lake, it was a matter of making it accessible and empowering the business to leverage that rather than making copies, right? So those became really two key examples. Now, if I take the same capability and you think about Gen AI and advanced analytics, it's no longer just classifying and detecting anomalies, right? You could be using AI to predict liquidity needs, identify unusual patterns, generate insights automatically, right? And because we've got trust in the foundation, which is clean, governed, real-time data, that's when you're going to get the value out of AI, right? Same thing with the customer 360. Just imagine right now you have a relationship manager who could be having conversational AI to answer, should I offer this client more credit, right? Based upon all this, the real-time exposure, utilization trends and everything. I've also used data for transformation programs, right? So I've
Uh-huh.
run cross core banking transformation. We've done a market divestiture, or I'd put a business case together for data center consolidation. Every major decision that I followed was backed by decision trees, to show the migration readiness. We looked at data quality metrics. I've done scenario what if analysis based upon it. Um, Reconciliation metrics, demonstrated our readiness and confidence. I could just go on and on, but I know there are more questions, so I'll stop at that.
No, no, I love the examples, especially that you're bringing in here. Like I personally remember we worked on some of these transformational
Yeah.
programs with you, and I remember very distinctly that at some point you halted the entire program, eventually saying like, listen, guys, like this, I get, we're into these robotic automation. I'm sure you remember, and eventually it's like there must be a more, cloud native at the time, data driven way of, embedding some of these controls into
I think we were
these.
talking about using the
Yep.
APIs that I already have, APIs around the data that I already had, rather than just doing the robotics to automate the process to leverage the APIs. I think that was our context at
Absolutely,
that point.
yeah, but definitely very much like focused on like actually real identifiable, auditable
Yeah.
data instead of kind of taking these manual steps. And so maybe my next question is kind of a little bit about that because that was an example where you personally kind of really kind of stepped in, you gave an opinion and point of view, articulated that. But maybe for other folks who have joined, here and are listening to this later, like if you think about somebody in a leadership role like yourself, like how can you help shape and model this type of behavior? And in your experience, what are the kinds of things that a leader like a position you are in can do? Yeah,
So leadership plays a very critical role. You can't just preach, you have to walk the walk, right? And so the leadership has to model the behaviors. So for me, the main thing was making metrics available for every executive review. And that was a culture, right? That's a culture that we had in the bank as well, is you consume the data and you monitor the metrics to basically able to evaluate where things are, right? And when you follow that behavior, that culture gets embedded and permeates across the organization. Examples. So when we operational resilience, that was a big program that we were running, over the last few 2 years or so. What one of the things that we looked at was to look at customer impacts, right? Improvement of the NPS scores, correlated that to the technology investment that was made. We showed a concrete reduction of incidents by over 50%, right? And all of this was correlated with the investments that were made, drew it to the data from engineering and delivery effectiveness, right? You're looking at deployment frequencies, lead time for changes, reduced failure rates because we had invested in our testing environments, automated our pipelines, and so you're able to show a full life cycle on how the investment is working and the results and the values that you're getting out of it. And then we further correlated that data with the investments that were made on preventive actions, right, such as
right.
third-party risks or scenario testing, tertiary backups, things like that to improve our recovery times or process recovery objectives and impact tolerances. So you continue, so using that data was what we eventually also used to get additional investments the following year. So it becomes this continuous process because you're able to quantify the outcomes and able to see it's almost like your money speaks, right? That's one
Yep.
aspect of it. When I put the business case together for data consolidation, of course, there was a cost aspect to it, but we also sold it as unlocking business capabilities. You had this entire landscape. When you're going to be doing a consolidation, you're looking at your systems, you're looking at opportunities to consolidate. Using the data strategy became an important part because we had the data lakehouse. We put in all our for APIs. So it was able to have almost like parallel systems. So you're able to figure out how to demise systems or consolidate systems. And the focus of the architecture at that point was to become AI ready. And we used use these metrics that we spoke about, and we use those metrics on a regular basis in our program updates and our executive updates and everything, right? And the other, of course, metrics is a big part of it, but also showcasing value, right? When you start talking about value and just saying, because we automated this process. It has now, it's got a cascade and has now improved my ability to automate a process. We took a seven-step process, automated that by just within weeks of making it a three-step process because the data was available. So when you start talking about a lot of this data, it becomes important. So metrics, showcasing value. Inherently, what you're doing also is that you're modeling curiosity about AI, right? So now leaders are asking questions such as what data, how current is it, what's the limitation, right? And those are the things that become BAU in your discussion, and that's what you're embedding in leadership. You're talking about as a leadership. You're having those discussions with your teams. Your teams are having the same discussion, and that's it's that snowballing effect, and it permeates across.
Awesome. I love the reference or the bridge into like AI readiness, right? It's one of these. I believe it's been the last year or two, we've been hearing that a lot more as one of these kind of activators of interest in things like data culture, data literacy, broader data foundations, I would say as well. But generative AI and all the whatever's the newest shiny tool that
Yeah.
everybody wants to use. But at the end of the day, you need to have data at a minimum level of a foundational quality. Karan, this is actually maybe a point that I'd love to bring you back into the conversation here. As we start to talk about AI, right? We've talked the past, what is it, half an hour about data culture specifically, but we're also hearing AI culture more often. Maybe from your perspective, how do you see those two relating to each other? Is there a meaningful difference? And does it really matter?
No, definitely great culture, Molly. Thank you again for the experience and giving real world examples of how you were able to bring value back to the business, right? So yes, we should talk about both data and AI culture. They are separate, but they have a lot of relationships together and differences together, right? So think of well, let's start with decision making. Like that's the impact, right? We can bring together. So um, we should always ask key business questions, right? Who is the one who is deciding what questions they need to get answered and what is the data they need, right? If you look at it in that bucket, that becomes your data culture, like understanding what data is there, how healthy the data is, are people using that data to make decisions? Now that becomes your foundation for the next level of maturity, which is the AI culture, right? Now, AI culture can say, can I now, first of all, do I know how to use AI? Do my employees know how to use AI? Do my customers know how to use AI? And are they expecting more AI answers? And then bringing that back to say the AI decisions are much more accurate now because my data is accurate, right? Uh, Prioritizing the use cases of AI, right? Because again, data culture gives you the foundation by which you will be able to prioritize what AI can be accelerated and not based on data observability and data health, right? So that's how both data and AI culture are related. But again, this is where the companies are trying to both mix of that together from a responsibility perspective. This is where I say, both the chief data and AI officer is the one responsible for the data and AI culture, right? And this also goes back to that org design of, do we have a chief data officer in the company, or do we have chief AI officer in the company, or do we have one person in the company? So again, it's just the differences are enough, but then also the collaboration is enough to have maybe one or two, distinct discussions of, what is the data and AI culture in the company. Goes back to that strategy.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Maybe Molly, back to you, and related to kind of what Karan was starting to get into. You already started to mention that some of this in your previous comments, but like as organizations start to embed automations, AI into more of their business processes, step by step, like these technologies, do they strengthen or weaken a data culture? What's the relation between the two, and how do you see that?
So to me, AI culture is an evolution of data culture, right? So I see them as being nested and not separate, right? because you cannot have a healthy AI adoption without data, all the guardrail and all the regulatory
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
compliance sense. You need it, right? It's almost like it's your license to operate. And so that's an important part of it, right? To answer your question directly, to be able to embed automation and AI in business processes and to get all those benefits, to me, what's really, really essential is, ensuring that you're able to have you're evaluating metrics, right, constantly on your data quality, on any of your validations, or when you start looking at access controls, all of that, right? Those all become extremely important. And until unless that's all embedded within your data, AI won't help. It'll just automate the chaos faster, right? So concrete examples would be, when you're looking at fraud detection, right? You can't just deploy the model and walk away. You need explainability on it. Why did it result in this, right? You still need the human in the loop for the high value decisions, right? You need the feedback loop. When AI is wrong, you need to go tweak it. You have to look at it from multiple perspectives. And I think, the other part of it really comes down to what makes it work, right? It's the ability to explain it that makes it work, and kind of taking it further. So for me, strong data culture means AI will get accelerated with good practices. Weak culture will mean, AI will accelerate chaos. And so whatever was on the left, sorry, I always get my right and left mixed, but left hand bottom part of your graph, that's what keeps things, very embedded. So bottom line, they're embedded, they're nested,
They really
and
are.
they
Yeah.
work with together, hand in hand.
I like maybe if I'm understanding and following you correctly, kind of the connection you're making between, AI working in a way that you understand. You need to open up that black box, right? It's like at the end of the day, what's
Yeah,
happening here? Why is the prediction being made? And at the end of the day,
you
it's
have to trust your
data,
data.
right? It's the
Exactly.
data that you would get that actually drives the predictions, the modeling, but even like how, tracing back to certain actions are being made or recommendations being made.
Yeah. And if you think of it, right, if you trust the data and you understand the quality, you understand the lineage, you understand all those factors, right? And now you start becoming the consumer of it, and you leverage it for your business processes or your investment or any of those other capabilities that you're using it for. That's, it feeds off it, right? And then you are starting to leverage the outcomes for further part of your processes, and the evolution really of kind of going off it, on taking it, right?
Very good, thank you. Um, So maybe following up on that, Molly, one more question is silos, right? Many operations organize, or to some extent, operate in silos for historic reasons or cultural reasons. You already talked a little bit about one team, if I recall correctly, like a
Yeah.
couple minutes ago. But like in your perspective, in your experience, what are some of the most effective ways to foster that collaboration, right? The notorious collaboration between business and IT. And then how have you done that?
I think you have to foster it, right? We
Uh-huh.
need to,
Hmm.
when you tell somebody, you've got to collaborate and everything, and you hear that and you walk away. But how do you foster it? And for me, to foster it is having shared metrics, and showcasing the value. You're using the metrics and and you're talking about the about the value that you're getting, and that is organically how, you know I think you will get the collaboration, and you start. So it's awkward when you start,
Right.
but once you start having a common outcome and you start measuring the outcome and you keep talking about the outcome, that's what happens. So for instance, you it becomes a language of collaboration. That's what I think, right? You're no longer talking about the business talking about and outcomes, and me in technology talking about schemas and stuff like that, we're both talking about the same destination, right? And so, when we were talking about data democratization, right, it's about access. You enable, it's empowered, the business is empowered to explore the data themselves because there are proper governance and guardrails in place. They're not dependent upon IT for any ticket. So you're not now needing to create a shadow IT team or anything. You've got the access. It's governed. You have dashboards and data sets on it, around it. And, and when you're looking at the data, it's not just raw data, right? It's conceptualized data. It's business domain objects that you're talking about, right? And this is where, if the data mesh principles apply, right? You're treating data as a product. It has SLAs, consumers, and, it's a little black box on its own. Um, Again, right? It's so that's one aspect of it. The second part of it really comes down to shared outcomes. So an example for that is when we were doing Operation Resilience, and we were able to reduce incidents by 50 or over 50%. It was a shared outcome, right? When the businesses were going to do these big ads and everything, technology was aware of it. We knew how much you could, how far the system would be able to go far. We also knew we weren't going to do a major deployment that day, so it's that entire conversational aspect of it. Or we had done some, a major feature was going to be coming out, just working across the testing, validation, and all of that. So you've got to collaborate to succeed. So I think collaboration comes inherently at that point of time when you're working through outcomes. And that's how we would kind of work through it. When you're talking about metrics, I look at metrics in multiple dimensions. You're looking at metrics from a quality perspective. You're looking at metrics from engineering perspective. You're looking at resilience metrics, and it just goes on. So you work through all of that, and it's like a Rubik's Cube, right? You're looking at multiple dimensions of it and making sense of it as well, right? So as an organization, you're picking on what those key ones are, and that becomes your mantra, and that's what you're following through.
Awesome. So Rubik's Cube. So let's take this Rubik's Cube to Karan, to you. So a lot of the things that Molly's been mentioning are very impressive, like complex processes, like breaking down silos, big organization, like had some really impressive, I think, achievements there. But maybe for folks on this call and who may be listening to it later as well, like what are to kind of make it very actionable, right? Like what are maybe some things that companies can do also if they can't have $1 million investment in a specific data culture or literacy program? Like, what are maybe some of the more tactical things that, it's end of November, December is always hard, right? So, like, if there's things that companies would like to get done and make some initial steps here, let's say Q1 of next year, like, what would some of those things be?
Yeah, definitely. Let me, Molly, first of all, thank you again for bringing this all together. So when you mentioned Rubik Roots, right? So a lot of the things when, whenever a new leader comes in organization, or the existing leader, they'll say, hey, we want to do our data maturity assessment, right? Like that has been the playbook, right? The thing with data culture is that there is no, or AI culture for whatever reason, there is no easy maturity assessment framework, right? And again, we have a way of working through that Rubik's Cube, like we talked about, right? Leadership, vision, data empowerment. I think we talked about collaboration. Molly talked about decision traceability, and then value realization, right? And all of those are some part of that Rubik cubes. Now, when someone says, "Hey, I don't have budget to create data culture," it's not a data governance program. Like data governance feeds into a data culture. But one of the things anyone can do at any level within the company for data culture is start with decision traceability. Like
Right.
what decisions are you taking, and how does those decisions impact the output of your data and whoever is using the KPIs, right? And that's what I think there was a question in the chat from our thought leader Gokul Mishra. So first of all, Gokul, I thank you for being here. And his question was, like, data culture follows decision culture, and can we discuss how decision culture drives data culture? And that's kind of what goes back to the question of you don't need a lot of budget to create a data culture. Data culture is all about
Right.
learning about what data you have, how are you using it, and then documenting the decisions and maybe have a common SharePoint in the company where you can say, here's a decision I took and what that enables us. I can give some examples of, if a leader decides on a software one for data governance and they can drive a decision and document it and say, hey, why did I pick, Alation, Colibra, Informatica, or whatever the solution is, uh, so that 5 years later, anyone in the company can go back and say, why did we as a company choose this software? Like that drives your data culture. Like that shows, or if I at daily level, I'm taking a decision of, again, I can, for an example, I can take a supply chain decision. Hey, okay, I'm going to route, this inventory to this warehouse versus this one, right? A and B. If I'm making that decision and I can document the reasons I took that decision in my daily job, that drives data culture. So again, Molly talked about IT versus business. Like mostly the data culture is not an IT versus business. It's what am I doing in my daily job and how I can document it uh, to drive that data culture. Right? So somehow it's like it's an everyday everyone's responsibility
Yeah.
to create the data culture versus someone saying one person's job to drive the data culture. Hopefully that answers the question, Willem, that data culture doesn't need a lot of budget unless you're doing an infrastructure project to do some basic governance, to bring that data and AI culture in.
Yeah, I
Congress.
liked the question that you wove into your answer, Karan, about kind of decision culture, data culture, and kind of relation between the two of them. Like it feels like they almost like drive each other. I really like this a while back. I remember we talked about this and specifically about like decision making, like the actual act of making decisions, within an organization. To take that to a little extreme in that discussion, like we actually at that point we talked about like recording them actually, like make them data, right? Like a lot of decisions are just done in a meeting verbally, and they're buried in an email, but they're not actually recorded. And it's not necessarily that easy, and that can be very kind of sensitive decisions, of course, that you don't want to necessarily democratize to everybody. But I thought that was a really interesting kind of suggestion or recommendation to potentially think about like the actual decisions that are being made in different teams and contexts, and recording those somewhere so that we as consultants have this many times. We come in into a new organization and we have this platform or there's this decision made. We don't quite know why, but we're here, right? But just having that traceability and not having to almost relearn some of the lessons of the past itself might be a really interesting
I
area to
also
discover.
I also think it's tied to your outcomes, right? You're doing something because you want a specific outcome. And so, and if you achieve your outcome or you're on your way to your outcome,
Yep.
that's what's feeding it more, right? And so, therefore, when you start talking about investments which are focused on an outcome, you're focused on the success failures of it, and that's what's driving your decisioning eventually.
Love that point. Love that point. So maybe final question, Molly, for you to wrap up for organizations that are starting a journey, towards this data culture. A lot of these things that we kind of just touched in the last 50 minutes or so. What's maybe one piece of advice that you'd give to a chief data analytics officer or CIO to kind of set the right tone, make sure that they have the right progress?
So for me, it is to basically say that data culture is a journey, right? It's a journey that eventually take you to your destination. So you're building capability. You start slow, you're building capability, and then it accelerates over time, right? You start seeing an exponential curve to it. So you've got to be patient on it, right? And you don't pick to boil the ocean. You pick a few business problems, that everyone acknowledges, and you make that data exemplary in short periods of time, right? And a couple of sprints rather than, massive big program transformation and everything. So for me, the focus areas is start with the outcomes, not with the organization chart, right? What is the business problem we're solving? Build around that. Build the strategy around outcomes and value, and not the organizational structure. So you focus on data models and evolve that, evolve your organization around that. If you try to do, a lot of groups are starting to, change their organization so that they can support, the cultural aspect of it. If you do both together, you'll lose the focus, and the metrics cannot quantify the chaos of a reorg. So to me, I think that's important, right? Second thing for me is API architecture, right?
Yes. Yeah.
That is your AI enablement layer, right? None of those agents can do much if you don't have the APIs around your data. So having that is important. So you're not just enabling internal automation, but when we're talking about breaking the silos and working across functions and everything, it's your APIs that are going to be interacting and enabling the your interaction as well as your integration with your AI systems, right? The, those are the 2 points that are definitely there. The third one comes down to resilience and governance. Extremely, extremely important. So, the destination, the journey, all of that is exciting, right? But to ensure that you're going to have a smooth trip, you need to embed control checkpoints in your process,
Mm-hmm.
right? You need the security, the authentication, authorization. You need the process, put technology controls around your inventory, upgrades, resilience, all of that, the traceability, everything that I've spoken about previously, right? You can't see them as bureaucracy. They're enablers. You need it. You need the compliance for all of that, right? You need to look at your incident response, your resilience. Those are all the key parts of it. To me, that's important, right? The fourth one is people, right? You have to continue to invest, right? Our teams are instrumental. They're the ones that are tying together their domain knowledge and the capabilities. They've weathered the wars. They from integration, production, and incidents. They understand the landscape, and so you need to continue to invest in their upliftment, right? So when you look at, we talk about data literacy, we talk about AI literacy, so it's important to understand what you can or cannot do. How far can you push the envelope, right? How do you validate outcomes and outputs? What does good look like, versus perfection? So those are important, right? In it. So those are the four things. Then the next part of it is to agree on the metrics, right?
Metrics again.
Agree on
Uh-huh.
your
Mm-hmm.
10 to 12 metrics, not everything. Like you don't want, I don't want to get drowned in dashboards, but identify your key metrics. For me, the key metrics are on, data quality, right? Is your data trustworthy? How do you track that? Completeness, accuracy, timeliness, right? Those kind of things. Usage, you know, are people actually using the data? Measure it, right? Measure the self-service adoption of it. Are people able to self-serve versus submitting IT tickets and all of that? Are you seeing active usage grow? Governance, which I've been going on about, is completeness, lineage, access, auditability, traceability, all of that. Business impacts, right? It's the data driving value. Are you getting the NPS improvements? Are you seeing the revenue growth, right? Engineering excellence, you're using the same DORA metrics, right? You're basically
Uh-huh.
tracking, because now I have the data and the APIs and everything, are my deployment frequencies improving? My lead time, is that improving? Are my incidents growing less, right? Operational resilience, another very, very important part of it. That's what generates your brand, really, right? To measure your resilience. So the most important point that I would leave it off for is the payoff is exponential. It's not linear, right? So you start slow and then it compounds, right? And build your foundation at the time from the very beginning rather than coming back for it. And I think that to me is the important part. See all of that governance as foundation.
Awesome, great exponential payoffs. I think that's what we're trying to kind of maybe share here. I'm also at least personally taking away from what you've been sharing with us, even more so than before, is this whole focus on like measuring stuff, measuring behavior, measuring usage, measuring trust. But like if you don't, I think what I'm taking away is if you don't invest just a little bit of time in converting, this concept of culture and literacy into something measurable,
Yeah.
whatever it may be, right? But it
But
might
don't go
be,
crazy and boil the ocean
yeah,
of metrics as well, right? Understand what those key ones are. So I picked a few
a
for me.
couple.
Yeah, and evaluate it, see if that works for you, and then add more or take out more. It's okay to say, "Ooh, that was too
In the
much. I
middle.
bit off," right?
I think even like the some of the archetypes that Karan has been talking about, like these metrics might kind of correlate stronger with one particular archetype than another. Like they might really, go back to the innovative
Absolutely.
behavior of a company. It might also, go back to compliance metrics depending on whatever is the most.
100%.
Yep, yep,
100%.
yep.
That was why I was saying, the when Karen went over those, I could see what's driving the what and the why, what's driving the how, what's driving the resilience. So
Uh-huh.
again, it was multiple facets of it, right? And so you don't just pick one, it's actually a combination, and you just learn to measure them and see the value on it and, increase and decrease. But do not give up on governance. That's the most important.
Yeah.
That's what's going to keep you out of jail.
Literally.
Molly, one thing I wanted to quickly add, right? When we talk about governance, everyone thinks that data culture is data steward's job, right? We never mentioned the word data stewards in the presentation, but data culture is not data steward's job
No,
only, right? The consumers of the data, if I'm the consumer of the data, I need to question the assumptions. Is the data correct? Can I make my decisions on it?
exactly.
That is what drives the data culture. Because a lot of the
100%.
folks will say, data culture is data steward's job. No, it's not. And
Yeah.
so that's where we need to start having that
And,
framework, and the Rubik cube you talked about is, who drives the data culture? And I think that
yeah,
might take a longer discussion on this.
it
But
could. But I will tell you that, it's very exciting and it's very interesting. We should probably discuss it another time. But it like you're spot on, right? It's embedded across the organization, right? And it's almost like when you go to invest money and you're going to buy something, you do a lot of research. You don't just assume that the company you're buying it from has done everything. You do you see what I'm saying? So you do all of that, and so therefore, yeah, 100% agree with you.
yeah, no, it's been
Awesome.
great.
Yeah, I think we can probably keep going for another hour, but we probably want to let some people go to their next meetings and all. Again, Karan, super thank you for coming on and sharing your expertise. Molly, it was wonderful to have you here. I hope we can maybe do something like this again in the future.
Yeah, love to.
Yep, and thanks everybody for joining. We'll post a recording somewhere in the next couple of days, and if there's any questions for any of us, feel free to reach out. And enjoy
Thank
the rest
you.
of your weeks.
Thank you. Happy
Thank
Thanksgiving to whoever's celebrating it. All
Yeah.
right, bye.
Thank you.
you.
Bye bye.